It was a big deal. Congress commissioned a National Neighborhood Commission in 1977. Imagine that. I mean, a national commission that needs to look into the issue of neighborhoods and why they're having troubles, right? This is in the wake, I think, of urban renewal and highway building, which had done so much damage to urban neighborhoods. So it was a big deal back in the 1970s. But since then, they've kind of receded. And I think I'll talk about that today, but I think, part of it has to do with the internet, has to do with a lot of things, right? That people think have maybe devalued neighborhoods. But I also think, and this is what Alan Mallach and I argue in our book, that we kind of have a romantic notion of neighborhoods that maybe causes us to think, well, neighborhoods are passé because that notion we have in our head of what a neighborhood is supposed to be is no longer true. But we have a different type of neighborhood, which is what I'll argue today. And I think it's just as important as ever. Neighborhoods are just as important ever. So I think the work you're doing to bring back attention to neighborhoods and to talk about how we can nurture neighborhoods and how we can bring back, instead of bowling alone, we can bowl together, right? And get together in our neighborhoods. All of that is just wonderful work. So I became interested in neighborhoods for a number of reasons. For one thing, I grew up in a very good neighborhood. I've looked back on it and thought, wow, that was really a good neighborhood back there in St. Paul, Minnesota. I don't know if there's anybody on this call from St. Paul, but I grew up in the Denoyer Park neighborhood in St. Paul, right on the Mississippi River, not too far from the University of Minnesota there. And I can read to you the description we have here from the book. The 3-room K-4 Denoyer Park School was the center of the community. It had a large playground with a jungle gym and a baseball field, and every winter the fire hydrant was tapped to flood 2 ice rinks. That was my job sometimes. After hockey practice, we would go and hook the hose to the fire hydrant and flood the rink so we'd have fresh ice the next day. Every year the PTA held a winter carnival with games of chance in the school, and Strauss waltzes played over loudspeakers for the skaters. My mother took charge of the Strauss waltzes, to make sure the record player had these great waltzes for skating. Todd's immediate neighborhood on Otis Avenue was especially close. On summer evenings, the kids would gather for games of tag and Simon Says, and every 4th of July, Mrs. Stoddard would invite everybody to a community picnic at her home on the Mississippi River. To this day, Todd remembers the names of dozens of families who lived on his street. I recently visited, my old neighborhood and just took a walk down the street, and I was shocked that I knew the names of, I would say, 25 or 30 different people on this block. So it was really an idyllic, upbringing with a very secure and safe and supportive neighborhood when I grew up. And then I was at St. Olaf College. And after my freshman year, I signed up for the urban experience, right? I thought this would be cool. I'll find out about what, big cities are like, So they sent us off to Detroit, and I'm getting up there in years. The year I went there was 1967. If any of you know about Detroit in 1967, it was a meaningful year. That was the year of the Detroit riots. We were coming home from a religious retreat in northern Michigan. We saw the smoke coming up from the fires in the distance in Detroit. And being young and naive, we decided, we got to go look at this fire, right? So we drove our little Volkswagen, to the fire, and we got within about a block of the fire, and it was so hot we couldn't get any closer. That's how hot it was. And we turned around and we said, well, something's going on here. This is not just a fire. So we turned around. The next thing we saw, plate glass windows being burst open, looters who were going into stores and taking things. And from then on, it was just chaos in Detroit. I woke up to the U.S. Army pulling in to Pershing Park across from our apartment. When we went into work we were told to bend down and run quickly in case there were snipers in the area. I mean, it was really a crazy time, but it really made me wonder, what are we doing? What's happening? Why are we, with all the white flight and fires and other things, why are we throwing away what seemed to be, really nice neighborhoods, wonderful housing, good brick frame housing, all this good stuff? What was happening here? Later on, I worked in community development for many years. I was a neighborhood planner on the east side of Cleveland. And then when I accepted my position here at UMSL, I helped to form a collaboration of community development corporations called the Community Builders Network. So I've been heavily involved in this work for many years. As David mentioned, just recently co-authored a book called The Changing American Neighborhood. I think David has a QR code on there. You can get it for 30% off if you'd like to buy it. It's a very comprehensive book, covers all sorts of different types of neighborhoods and tries to understand why they change or they don't change, right? So it's suburban neighborhoods and high poverty neighborhoods and Black neighborhoods and integrated neighborhoods and yeah, all sorts of different neighborhoods. So you can purchase it and you can dive in and sample chapters if you're not going to read the whole thing. So my whole career has been about building good neighborhoods and what we can do and not do about it. My plan for today is to talk about the what I call the romantic conception in our minds of this tight-knit, urban, usually ethnic neighborhood we have in mind when we think about a tight neighborhood. And then I'm going to talk about the new type of neighborhood we have in America today, based on what we call weak ties. A little bit like the high five video, right? A little bit like that. And then after my talk, I'm glad to talk about other issues that affect neighborhoods like gentrification, economic inequality, all these sorts of issues. So we can obviously open it up with that. So let me begin by talking about the old tight-knit urban ethnic neighborhoods we're so used to. A friend of mine, Bill McClellan, is a columnist in St. Louis. He's sort of the Mike Royko of St. Louis, if you know Royko in Chicago. But he did a column a few months ago, and he said this. In those days, referring to the 1930s during Prohibition, right? St. Louis was a city that worked. Consider how the police department dealt with illegal stills or making booze, right? Uh, that proliferated during Prohibition. The Irish cops were sent to bust the stills in the Italian neighborhoods, and the Italian cops were sent to bust the stills in the Irish neighborhoods. Nobody should have to bust their neighborhoods still. Neighborhoods mattered. Back in those days, neighborhoods were important. You wouldn't send an Irish cop into an Irish neighborhood, right? They were tight. They were not going to harm each other. So that was Bill's way of saying those are the good old days, right? When neighborhoods really mattered. There was the Carey Patch was the Irish neighborhood in St. Louis, which is now Dogtown. I was there recently during St. Patrick's Day, and I got stuck in a traffic jam like you can't believe it, right? For the St. Patrick's celebration. There's also the Hill. If you've ever been in St. Louis, the Hill is the Italian neighborhood, and classic sort of ethnic, tight, urban neighborhood from northern Italy, not southern Italy. Big difference here. They all settled on the Hill, and it's got still a very tight urban ethnic neighborhood today. Pretty small in terms of population, but has lots of great restaurants and bakeries and coffee shops and other such things. The traditionally, of course, people in these tight urban ethnic neighborhoods of old, the old Irish and Italian, etc. neighborhoods, they would sit on their front porches schmoozing with their neighbors. They would keep their windows open, watching the kids play in the street. We kind of have this image in our head, right? They went to the local church or temple, and they invited each other to each other's baptisms and bar mitzvahs and weddings and things like that. Neighborly relations were strong, dense, and resonant with shared values and lifestyles. Kind of like the bar and Cheers where everybody knows your name, right? In these old neighborhoods, everyone knew your name, just like I did on Otis Avenue in St. Paul. I knew everybody's name. So traditional tight-knit urban neighborhoods are largely passé. They're largely a thing of the past. Neighborly relations today are not as thick or as tight and intense as they once were. Our social networks are more geographically dispersed for a number of reasons. My co-author and I had to admit when we were working on this book on neighborhoods, we had to admit we didn't sit on our front porch smooshing for hours with our neighbors, right? In fact, we even had to admit to each other we often didn't know the names of our neighbors. But yet we were convinced that our neighborhood was very important. We enjoyed our neighborhoods. We liked our neighborhood, but it didn't seem to fit that conception in our mind, which they still exist. Don't get me wrong. There are these tight-knit urban ethnic neighborhoods, but we have for the most part, a very different neighborhood milieu today. So what has happened to these tight-knit urban ethnic neighborhoods? Um, well, one thing that happened is air conditioning. I mean, air conditioning means that people don't sit out on their front porch trying to catch a breeze on a hot day, right? They're inside their house, you know. And on a hot Missouri day, try walking through a neighborhood sometime and see how many people you see sitting out talking to their neighbor. There's not too many. And if you know how hot it is in Missouri, you understand why they're doing this, right? It's not by accident. Uh, um, uh, People used to, in fact, years ago, people used to go sleep in the parks and they didn't have air conditioning. They were literally going to the parks and sleep on a hot summer day, right? It was too damn hot inside their apartment. That wasn't common, but that's what happened, right? It was an example of the old style neighborhood. The second thing that happened is the internet, right? And handheld devices, which are a big deal, right? Which carry the internet literally at the tip of your fingers. You have the entire world at your disposal, right? It's just an amazing e-commerce, telecommuting, right? You can work by not actually having to go there. You can shop by not actually having to go out of your house, right? How many of you have seen people in your neighborhood walking down the street looking at their phone, right? Probably, by the way, driving and looking at their phone, which is more problematic, but many people are walking down the street looking at their phone. So that has really played a role in reducing these kind of dense, interactions that occurred traditionally in neighborhoods. Oops, my battery is running low. This makes me a little bit nervous. I tell you
Uh-oh.
what I'm going to have to do, David, is I'm going to have to plug in here. I thought I was going to be okay.
All
I'm going to have
right.
to plug in, and this is going to cause some complications, I think, but we'll see here. So I apologize if we get
No
cut off.
problem.
I'll
It
come
should
back.
charge right up.
Okay. I hope it's okay. Y'all still there?
Yep, we're still here.
I'm
Does it
hoping
show that
it's
it's charging?
charging there we go. Um, are y'all there?
We're still here.
Well, you know what? I can't see you, but here, now I think I can't see you because I had to switch to a new screen. Now I'm good. What's going to
Okay.
be a little
Or
odd here, you will find, is that I'll be looking over your forehead because I'll be looking at a second screen. But hey, it'll work okay, right? So besides air conditioning and the internet, we also have other factors that have contributed to the decline of these older style urban ethnic tight neighborhoods. One is deindustrialization, the loss of industrial jobs. People often walked to work or took the trolley to work, right? In factories. Many in the Hill, in the Italian neighborhood in St. Louis, walked to clay mines that were close by. They would mine the clay for the bricks in St. Louis. And the word is that, the Italians would mine the clay and the Germans would lay the bricks, right? This is all connected to these urban ethnic neighborhoods. Between 1967 and 2012, just as an example, the city of St. Louis lost 115,000 manufacturing jobs that were really the anchor of the community, these factories, right? These pretty decently paying manufacturing jobs. That's 87.5% of all the manufacturing jobs in the city. So we lost almost 90% of the manufacturing jobs, which really devastated these communities. The second factor that happened is women entered the workforce. Stay-at-home moms were really the glue that held together these ethnic, urban, tight neighborhoods that I talked about. My mom was a kind of busybody in the neighborhood, right? Always kind of talking to the other moms about what's going on, making sure that things were kept in order. Between 1960 and 2020, for example, the percentage of households with a married couple and children fell from 44% to 19%. So that old kind of core demographic, a married couple with children and the woman staying home, right, is no longer the norm. And that was something that really held up this earlier generation of neighborhoods. And then yet another trend that impacted these neighborhoods is the civil rights revolution. Between 1970 and 2020, there has been a 30% decline in neighborhood racial segregation. Now, I think a lot of us would wish that the decline had been more. We had more integration, right? But we've had significant racial integration. African Americans have considerably more choice in where they can live than they had in a prior period. In the prior period, Blacks were essentially confined often to what you might call ghettos. That word suggests, total negative. But in some ways, these communities were well-functioning communities, in part because They were tight-knit, they were dense, they had relationships, and they had people from many different walks of life living in the same neighborhood, right? You had lawyers and business owners together with caretakers and laborers, right? And that created to a really pretty well-functioning neighborhood. There's a good book by Lance Freeman on Haven or Hell. This idea were these earlier ghettos, were they hellish, or were they in some senses havens where African Americans actually had a certain freedom, right? And a certain kind of tight-knit togetherness that really worked at some level. Even though we have to acknowledge, right, that they were excluded often from other neighborhoods with perhaps a better tax base, and excluded from other neighborhoods and excluded from the job market, right, from getting good jobs. So we don't want to romanticize this earlier period, but it did reinforce this notion of this tight neighborhood. Uh, so Black migration with the civil rights movement precipitated white flight, people's fears. There was a huge amount of white flight, and it just demolished many older urban neighborhoods as people moved outward. They would have moved outward anyway, in any case, right? As they have more money, you can afford a bigger house, you can move to the suburbs. But that kind of rapid, kind of panic-stricken flight really caused some neighborhoods to collapse. And so this is the final trend I want to talk about, which is suburbanization. As people move up economically, they tend to move out geographically to larger homes on larger lots. The city of St. Louis has gone from 850,000 to less than 290,000 today. So a huge exodus to the suburbs. And of course, this drained those urban neighborhoods that still exist in fabric, right? I mean, still the fabric is there, but the people often aren't. So we have this nostalgia for these neighborhoods. The Mr. Rogers neighborhood, I think you referred, David, to the Mr. Rogers, right?
Yep.
Or Sesame Street neighborhoods. You know, you sit on your front stoop with each other. These are great, but you know, the Mr. Rogers neighborhood is just not coming back. I hate to say this, even though I love Mr. Rogers. The film is great, by the way. You should see the film of Mr. Rogers. It's a great film. I read the book too. It's great. But we have to recognize that these old style neighborhoods, which were tight communities, as I said, I grew up in one, and it was a great launching pad for me. It had a feeling of stability and tightness and community support that was fantastic on Otis Avenue there in St. Paul, Minnesota. But they had their flaws, right? They were highly racialized and gendered. In other words, in my neighborhood in Donaire Park in St. Paul, I don't remember a single family of color in the entire neighborhood, right? It was a very racially segregated period. And, you know, as I said, women stayed home, but that meant that women were excluded from the job market. Back then, women did not have an opportunity to compete for many jobs, right? That's just the way it worked. So both for African Americans and for women, it's been a liberation, a new choices we have, but those new choices and that liberation and that mobility has in some sense undermined these traditional urban neighborhoods that we kind of still, I think, have in our mind as to what a neighborhood should be like. So what does the modern urban neighborhood look like? Even though neighborhood relations are less intense today, the book I wrote with Alan argues that the physical and social spaces created by neighborhoods matter more than ever for the health and well-being of 21st century Americans. The weak ties nurtured in modern neighborhoods help bridge the social divides that plague our society and reduce social isolation and loneliness. So they still are extremely important, even though they're not as tight and as perhaps intense as they were in earlier generations. So what do I mean by weak ties? The idea of weak ties is based upon an article by a sociologist, Mark Granovetter, that I think has been cited like 7,000 times. I wish one of my articles had been cited 7,000 times. But whenever you write an article, you got to have a provocative title like "The Strength of Weak Ties," right? Then you can get cited. But it's also a great article in other ways. So what are weak ties? Weak ties are casual or cool relations we have. We don't necessarily know the name of the person we're interacting with. We don't invite them into our home or over to our children's baptisms, right? But we have encounters with them and we're familiar with them at some level. So, for example, if you're in the neighborhood, you might encounter somebody walking their dog. You might just nod and say hello. You might pet the doggy, right? You have these little interactions in the neighborhood. You might have an interaction with your favorite barista at the local coffee shop. They recognize you, they might even say your usual, a 2% latte in my case. So you have these interactions, right, with people in the neighborhood. They're kind of informal, and you don't know their names, like I said, but they are what we call weak ties, and they are important. Weak ties are what Robert Putnam in his book Bowling Alone calls bridging social capital. They create bridging social capital. What I mean by that, weak ties create um, social relationships across differences, right? People have different religions, people have different classes, people have different um, uh, um, racial backgrounds, whatever. They interact through these weak ties. And as you can imagine, weak ties can bridge these divides because they're not as intense, right? I mean, we'd be less likely to have an intense, personal relationship with somebody who's different from us. But these weak encounters form a kind of relationship with people who are different from us. There's even a political scientist who talk about cities as the being together of strangers, right? Learning to get along, even though we're kind of strangers to each other. I wouldn't really like to use the word strangers because we're not really strangers. We nod to somebody in the neighborhood. When I go for walks in my neighborhood in the Central West End here in St. Louis, I recognize people. I don't know their name, but yeah, that's that old man. I see him over there sitting on the bench all the time. Oh, there's the lady with her poodle again. So I recognize them, but don't necessarily know their names. Um, we're not saying, by the way, that people don't have close friends in the neighborhood. That's not the point. Many people do have close friends in the neighborhood, do have bonding social capital, as Putnam would call it, which is this tight reciprocal relationships where I do something for you, you do something for me, and it's really a kind of reciprocal relationship. Um, but we're not saying that people don't have these, but we are saying that the weak ties or the casual ties are the essence of modern neighborhoods. So weak ties are nurtured by certain types of places. Relatively dense communities with a mix of land uses and public spaces where people can mingle and encounter one another on a daily basis are what encourage weak tie neighborhoods. You have to have spaces where people kind of bump into each other, right? In public spaces, unthreatening places. They're sometimes called third spaces, which could be private spaces like a coffee shop, right? Where you can hang out in the coffee shop and encounter other people in the neighborhood. The word neighbor, by the way, comes from the Old English, meaning people living near to a certain place, from the Old English. So neighborhoods are about people who live close to one another, in proximity. That's what a neighbor is, right? Somebody who is physically close. So if we live physically close to one another and we have a certain type of physical structure in the neighborhood, we're going to bump into each other in these public spaces in an unplanned way, by the way. We don't plan these encounters, right? They're serendipitous or random in some ways, right? But they occur. Suburban, low density, single use communities. By single use, I mean you have housing over here, you have retail over there, you have office over there. They're separated geographically. Single use communities that are completely reliant on the automobile for most functions do not nurture weak ties. In those types of neighborhoods, you choose whom you interact with, right? You make a deliberate decision to get in your car and go to someplace, right? To go to your recreation complex or whatever it might be, right? You don't have these sort of serendipitous encounters. They also tend to be more homogeneous in all sorts of ways. And you create your social networks intentionally, right? And now, of course, people who live in weak tie neighborhoods also have such relationships, right? They curate, certain close relationships. Yeah, I join a club and I go there and I play tennis, with people, and I go to my tennis, courts, and I play with my friends and play tennis. Sure, I have those friends, but that's not the essence of the neighborhood. The essence is these kind of encounters, right, in the neighborhood, which are unplanned and serendipitous. So what are the weak ties in these modern neighborhoods have all sorts of benefits that are really important in our day and age. And this is in the original Granovetter article, he talks about this, they help people to get ahead. That is to say, weak ties are very useful because they create social networks where you may find out about something that you otherwise wouldn't find out about it, right? Because it's outside of your tight social network. So research has shown that weak ties are correlated with job opportunities, right? You often find out about job opportunities through a kind of casual encounter with somebody who mentions that so-and-so is hiring, right? Or whatever it might be. So they're helpful for people to get ahead. They're also helpful for people to get along, right? To get along with each other because, as I said, they bridge social divides. Casual interactions generate a degree of tolerance of difference that we really need in the society we live in, where we have fostered a sense of fear and a sense of otherness and, a sense of threat, perhaps. And when you encounter people who are different from you in these kinds of weak tie neighborhoods, once again, you may not love them, you may not be super close to them, but you develop a certain tolerance and trust, right? Because we're sharing the same space. We're living in the same space. Weak ties also overcome social isolation and loneliness. A while back, the Surgeon General declared that loneliness was an epidemic in American society, especially following the pandemic, I think. And it's comparable to smoking. That is to say, if you don't have relationships, right? If you're feeling extremely lonely, that can be like smoking a pack of cigarettes on your health. You need to, you need social relations in order to get ahead. I recently read, my wife pointed out to me that dementia is related to loneliness. Loneliness tends to generate dementia, right? If you have social interactions, a kind of lively social life, you're less likely to get dementia. I've explored some of the social psychological research. It's not the field I'm really an expert in, but I began reading articles about these casual encounters between people and why they're valuable. And one study I thought was interesting. They gave people a clicker, and every time they had an interaction, with somebody who they know their name, and it was a close relationship of some sort, they clicked with the red clicker. And every time they had a casual interaction, when they had interaction with somebody, however superficial, where they didn't know their name, right, they would click the black clicker, right? And then they gave them tests of happiness and a sense of social connection. There's a series of questionnaires they would give them. Are you, in terms of their satisfaction and happiness with their life, and in terms of their sense of social connection with people? Do they feel socially connected? What they found is that strong ties, right, were highly correlated with happiness and social connection. But independently of the strong ties, weak ties were strongly correlated with a sense of social connection and a sense of happiness. So these kind of weak ties create a sense of well-being that we may not even be aware of, right? Just by being in public spaces. I know in my case, every once in a while I go to a coffee shop and work there. I don't know why I do this because I don't even talk to anybody, but I'm sitting there in this public setting. I'm kind of awash in people, right? And I think we as a human beings, for a lot of time, we lived in small tribes, right? And we were constantly around other people. And I think it's just not healthy to be isolated. And these weak ties, I think, are very valuable. And finally, weak ties help neighborhoods to defend themselves. Paradoxically, strong ties can divide a neighborhood and make it vulnerable, interestingly enough. So, for example, tight neighborhood subunits, whether one calls them cliques, clans, families, or gangs, organized along the lines of kinship, race, religion, or other strong ties, can fragment the community and weaken neighborhood-level social capital. So in the original study by Granovetter, he talked about Boston's West End, which was a tight Italian neighborhood that was being threatened by urban renewal. And they were not able to organize effectively against urban renewal because they had these tight, cliques, right, that couldn't span the whole neighborhood and get people on the same page across the different social parts of the neighborhood. Whereas neighborhoods that have weak ties, those weak ties are sitting there. They're kind of like social capital. It's just sitting there, and it can be activated at any time, right? You have a kind of minimum level of trust, a kind of floor level of trust that you can mobilize the neighborhood if the neighborhood is going to be threatened by a highway or by a noxious land use or you name it. So weak ties provide a kind of stored up trust and social connections across different groups that can be mobilized when the neighborhood is threatened. So weak ties, in some ways, like I said, are more valuable than strong ties, because strong ties tend to be rooted in particular communities and prevent the kind of collaboration across these different communities that is needed if you're going to really defend yourself against outside threats. Uh, Weak tie neighborhoods finally help to reconcile the deep-seated tension in American culture between individualism and community. In these neighborhoods, we can live in a community and form valuable human connections without what might be the suffocating conformity that often occurs in small towns or villages. I'm not saying there's something wrong with small towns, but it's a certain kind of, right, conformity, a certain kind of tightness that doesn't allow individuality. So if you have these weak tie neighborhoods, you can kind of be your own person, but you're still part of a community, right? It reconciles, as I said, individualism and community. So in conclusion, we have a nostalgia for traditional neighborhoods that nurture deep communal ties. Neighborhoods don't do that anymore. They're different. We find strong friendships and communal ties elsewhere, at work, at church, by joining a club or whatever it is. But we need the weak ties nurtured in modern neighborhoods, in relatively dense, mixed-use neighborhoods. It helps to overcome loneliness. It helps to bridge the social divides. Weak ties are are possible, I believe, in small towns and rural areas. I'm not saying that these types of social connections don't exist, in suburbs and in small towns and villages. Sure, they do. If you have shared space, if you have a certain interaction, right, in public spaces, you can generate these kinds of weak ties. But it's going to be nurtured the best in the kind of denser, more pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use settings where people encounter each other in public spaces. So I'm glad to answer any questions you might have, and also to address issues like gentrification and economic inequality that I think are really some of the prominent threats to the modern types of neighborhoods I've been talking about. So
Yeah,
let me turn it back to you, David, and I'm glad to entertain any questions.
yeah. Hopefully several people have questions. Take yourself off mute and ask verbally and jump right in.
I find it interesting that a neighborhood in Springfield is the same size land-wise as the entire city of Hallsville, but it's like 4 to 5 times the population. And I'm just like, how do you fit that many people in such a small area?
Yeah, pretty dense construction for sure. And this whole this whole idea, Todd, of the weak ties, strong ties, is one of the other categories no ties. Since we're talking about loneliness, it seems like there are quite a few people these days that
Well,
have no ties, really.
I mean, I throw it open to the group, but I think that um, the less you know about other people, the less encounters you have with people other different from you, the more you're prone to, frankly, adopt stereotypical views and and to generate fears and kind of the kind of sense of threat that exists when you don't really encounter people at some level. So I think there's a lot of that in American society, David,
Yeah.
because people are not encountering themselves. They're people who are different from them. And I don't want to once again romanticize weak tied neighborhoods. I'm not saying that, people who live in these neighborhoods don't have their own fears and don't have their own, issues. But in general, and the research is clear, by the way, for example, on racial relationships or relationships across, let's say, Hispanic, immigrant, and Caucasian natives. The research is pretty clear that people who interact in social spaces develop more tolerance than people who don't, other things being equal, if you control for a lot of variables, right? And so it also, by the way, it's a little tricky because the interaction is more beneficial if they are involved in a common civic project. That really generates a sense of toleration and respect, right?
Mm.
We're doing this together, right? To get something done. And also, if it's people of a relatively similar socioeconomic background, right? who interact. So, it can be, it can, interactions are not always smooth, especially when, you have big socioeconomic differences. So, there's a little bit of nuance and complexity here, but I do think that social isolation, and especially following the pandemic, frankly, the pandemic just was like a solvent that somebody, poured onto society, and it dissolved away a lot of social relations. And we're building them back, I think, but it's been difficult. And people, I don't know about what you're all on this call, what your experience is, but my experience is that people just don't get together quite as steadily or as much as we did before the pandemic. It's kind of, I feel like we're kind of struggling to get back to these kinds of social connections that existed before the pandemic.
Yeah. Others, and Carolyn, I wasn't meaning to skip over your comment there. I think she was just drawing the point that some of these neighborhoods are pretty densely populated. There's a lot of ability to have connections.
Well, and that's one benefit, oddly enough, that came out of COVID is the emphasis on walking and biking infrastructure as well as e-scooters and things. You're not surrounded by metal, and you're actually going to be seeing people's face, and you can actually say hi to them.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I've noticed that when I'm driving, I don't know about y'all in this call, but out there in the streets in St. Louis, sometimes it feels like a war, and people are driving way too fast, and they're going right through red lights, and I find it quite upsetting, to tell you the truth. But I find myself getting upset. I'm driving my car, right? I get, that guy just cut me off. And what it is, when you're in a car, everybody else is an opponent, right? When you're walking pedestrian, seeing other people is actually kind of fun, right? They're not, when you see other people around, that's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of interesting, you don't view them as a threat, but other cars are a problem, not a pleasure, right? And so I find that, I never have I never have a very benign view of humanity when I'm out there in the traffic jam, right? But when I'm around people, I like to people watch. People like to people watch. People like to go where there are people. One of the best urban spaces that was famously analyzed is the front steps of the public library in New York, where people sit on the steps of the library and watch people. People like to watch other people. That's what they do. And but I think we've gotten away from that. If we spend a lot of times in cars, right, and a lot of times, of course you have to use cars. I don't let say I'm not an anti-auto person, but the more time we can spend, I think, walking and interacting in local spaces, the better off we are.
Others, jump in.
Question. Can you hear me?
Yes, and then Megan, you're next. Go, Stan.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Stan. So suppose let's just say you live in a hypothetical community where you and the neighbors get together and say, okay, what we want to do is improve weak ties in our community. What suggestions do you have? I know there are things that are be community specific, but anything generic, let's say, what kind of 5-year strategy do we need to improve the weak ties in our community?
Good question. Excellent question. And some of it is about physical design, I think, Stan. Some of it is about thinking about communities. And I, I'm a proponent of the new urbanism, although I kind of like the older urbanism even more than the new urbanism. I could discuss why exactly that is, but the point is, having a nice weaving in of different uses so people kind of can interact and having public spaces, and public spaces need to be built right. You can't just have a big park that is too big for the community, because the park will be there won't be enough people in the park, enough eyes on the park, and it won't feel safe. But if you have a park that's scaled with the community, and they have a kind of, as Jane Jacobs would talk about, Jane Jacobs was a great theorist, by the way, of weak ties. In fact, our idea of weak ties is drawn in part from Jane Jacobs, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. It's one of the great books about cities. You know, we really borrowed our idea in part from Jacobs. I think we supplemented it, but she points out that, you know, when you have people who go into a park at different hours, at different times for different purposes, the park is like a constant ballet of weak ties, right? You're kind of encountering people. Some people are coming home from work. Some people are going to play with their kids. Some kids are going to school, you know, at different times. And that interaction really enhances these weak ties. So part of it is physical design. And there's a lot of work there by the new urbanists, you know, who Plater Zyberk and Duaney and others, you know, who have theorized about how to make cities where there's more natural interaction among people that occurs, right? And that requires a certain density. And you know, as I say in the work I've been doing in community, density often in America is a 4-letter word, right? It's like, you know, a bad word. But we should, instead of using the word density, we should say, how about walkability? You like walkability? Oh yeah, I like walkability, but I don't like density. Density is bad. Well, it turns out you can't have walkability without a certain degree of density, right? So what density does is it creates the opportunity to have local retail, to have a coffee shop. You can't have a coffee shop unless, you know, a certain number of people go to it each day. Now, if you have a big enough parking lot, you can have people drive into the coffee shop. And there's a lot of Starbucks that do okay with drive-in traffic, but most coffee shops need pedestrian traffic, right? And but I would say also, Stan, and this, I would turn to this group. I bet you have many more ideas than I have. And in fact, some of the stuff that David has pointed out, different ways of doing it, you know, to encourage people to interact and to say hi to each other. I did see something here about saying hi. What was this? There's one of the in the chat. There was something that was really interesting about encouraging people to say hi. I don't know about you, but I go around the neighborhood, and when I walk in the neighborhood, sometimes people just walk right past me, you know, just, you know, without looking at me, you know, or whatever. And usually though, usually I like it when you just sort of acknowledge somebody. Yeah, hi, you know, sort of, you can tell with your eyes even. You can even make a little greeting with your eyes, right? In which you acknowledge somebody else's presence. So I think there are probably ways within the existing physical fabric, right, to encourage weak ties by having social events. I mean, anytime you have like a farmer's market, boy, you're going to generate all sorts of weak tie interactions, right? I once saw the data on how many words are used when you go to a supermarket versus how many words are used when you go to a farmer's market. And the farmer's market was like 20-1, right? I mean, you get in all these conversations with people, right? You interact. So I think things like farmers markets, things like, you know, community concerts, all these sorts of things that David, you know, you've really, you know, your site talks about. I think these are all good ways to kind of get people out and interact in ways that they may not, once again, become great buddies, but they're interacting in public spaces and generating these weak ties. And then hopefully they'll generate some strong ties too. Don't get me wrong. We're not saying, you know, strong ties are not important. Sure, you might become best friends with somebody you meet at a farmer's market, right? But so I don't know. I would turn to this group. Bet they've got many more ideas than I have. You probably have more ideas than me, Stan.
Well, I don't know.
I think so.
Thanks.
I'm not hearing you, David. What's going on here?
I might jump in if that's okay,
Sure.
David. Okay,
David
great.
is somehow quiet to me, at least. But anyway.
Yeah, he is to me as well. So I'm just going to jump in. Hello, Megan Heather. I'm joining this call from Manchester, Missouri at 141 on Manchester Road, so I'm not too far from you. This has been a really stimulating and kind of challenging conversation for me. So thank you so much. Here in Manchester, we're really working on strengthening our civic fabric, is what we're calling it. And we're really talking, we believe in the power of neighborhoods. We believe in the power of neighbors. I'm associated with city government, but really we believe that the neighborhoods have the solutions to the challenges we're facing, all of that kind of orientation. And I appreciated Stan's question, you know, how do we improve our weak ties? And this vocabulary about strong ties and weak ties, this feels like this is a new vocabulary for me. And it feels like a real practitioner's kind of, academic kind of vocabulary, because improving weak ties isn't making stronger ties. Improving weak ties is making more weak ties. So we're doing some sessions around care and belonging. We just did a Saturday where we talked about what does it mean to care for your neighbors? What does it mean to provide community care? We're doing belonging in a couple of weeks. And this whole idea occurs, this is why it's been challenging and stimulating, is that this idea of weak ties really is an easier on-ramp, I think, for people than just jumping into relationships of deeper intimacy. That's scary. That requires vulnerability. That requires a lot of energy. But this weak ties notion does provide that bridging capital you're talking about for resiliency. So I've just had a lot of light bulbs go off. So I know I'm reiterating back to you what you've said, but it's been pretty powerful for me. The challenge that, as I sit here, is as I think about, okay, how do I translate this into talking to my neighbors and talking with community about it, is this vocabulary around weak ties. I mean, inherently the word weak doesn't sound like it has as much value. And so I'm just really curious, when you go to speak to communities and you speak to neighbors and you only have 5 minutes, right? Or you only have that social media post, or, kind of that shorter engagement opportunity. How do you choose to kind of talk about that? I see that Chet in the chat just put, I think, casual and informal ties. I was playing around with casual too, but I would just love to hear you explore a little bit about how we might talk about this value and these things with our communities.
Well, Megan, this is a great question. I think you're exactly correct. If you go out in the community and said, let's promote weak ties, they'd go like, well, what's wrong with you? Why don't we promote strong ties? What is this? They'd have to read, Mallach and Swanstrom or something like that, or, to get a sense of what this is all about. So I think you're hitting the nail on the head. One of the ways, I think I would talk about it just off the top of my head, is face-to-face encounters. And that's why, handheld devices and the internet and all that has been, I think, so corrosive, because the internet can be good. The internet can be good. In fact, there's research on it that internet can actually be used to promote face-to-face relationships between people that promote weak ties, right? But it can also be a substitute for face-to-face interactions, which is not good, I think, because when you're online, you will say things about other people and you will promote stereotypes or things that you wouldn't do in person. You wouldn't say that to somebody's face, right? So face-to-face is maybe one language, I don't know. Let's get back to face-to-face relationships, not online. Online can be used to facilitate getting together for face-to-face, you know what I mean? But it shouldn't substitute for that. Some people use it as a substitute, which I think is a real problem. And I think promotes polarization and division, because people will, once again, my department, once again, we had just a number of years ago, we were deciding some issue. We had this whole discussion via email, and it was bad because people got locked into positions and started saying things that they wouldn't have said in a face-to-face meeting. They really wouldn't have. So I would use perhaps the language of face-to-face encounters. Let's get out there in the community and be with each other, right? And don't necessarily talk about weak ties, but talk about how, we need to meet each other face-to-face in the community, in person, not remotely, and not formally. And then I guess the other thing I'd say is, to what extent can you create more opportunities for what I call serendipitous encounters? That is to say, encounters that are not planned and chosen and curated by the individual, And I think that's what's going to create the bridging social capital, as Putnam talks about it, that I think is so important for functioning communities. I think, any effort that brings people together in safe public spaces to encounter each other face to face, and sometimes doing something together, like a community garden, is going to nurture these kinds of ties that will bridge the social divides in the community and really make the community, as you use the word, resilient. Make it more resilient because, if it needs to get together, it can get together because it has this sort of pool of trust that was created by these face-to-face encounters.
Thank you.
Hopefully my microphone is fixed now. I hope. Okay. Not sure how that other happened, but anyway, maybe might have time for one more, if one other.
Face to face is good, but what we want to be careful of is that we don't end up increasing the divide between blind and sighted members of the community.
By using that terminology, you mean?
With the technology, small printed material that is typically handed out is not immediately accessible. But the technology that we use, whether it's for social media, whether it's ebooks or what have you, has screen readers and screen magnifiers built in that give blind people the same immediate access that sighted people have had for centuries.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn. Yeah, I always appreciate that you speak up and draw our minds back to those examples. You're good to do that. Thank you. Well, see no others. I always want to be a good steward of everybody's time that's on this call and our guests that join us. I know you joined me in thanking Todd Swanstrom for sharing an hour of his time with us, and the recap email that goes out to everybody who's in the group that does or will contain that little code for a 30% off the book. If you're interested in getting a copy of the book, it's a great read. I'd really encourage it. And Todd, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, David. Have a good day, everybody.
Appreciate everyone.